Hi, welcome to this Facebook Live. I think we're also going live on YouTube with the Committee for a Workers' International, the CWI. The CWI is a world socialist organisation bringing together Marxists, workers and young people across the globe. I'm Sarah Sachs-Eldridge, and today I'm going to be asking some questions to Tony Saunois, who is the Secretary of the CWI. Hi Tony.
Hi there Sarah, how are you?
Good, thanks for coming into this discussion today. Before we start though, before I ask you the first question, I just wanted to draw anyone who's watching this their attention to the CWI website, socialistworld.net, because last week we posted up a new statement on the coronavirus crisis. It's called Coronavirus Plunges Capitalism into Global Turmoil and the Need for a Socialist Alternative. And that's basically going to be the theme of our discussion here today. So, Tony, let's get started. This coronavirus, of course, is a natural disaster, but it's revealing so much about all the ways that capitalism is unable to keep society safe. The CWI has spent the decades of its existence explaining why capitalism is a crisis-ridden system, and this situation could not make that more clear, could it?
That's absolutely true. What we see in this crisis, which is unprecedented in the history of capitalism, it's a devastating condemnation of capitalism. And you said, Sarah, in some ways correctly, that it's a natural disaster. Well, there is an element of that about it, but it's also a disaster which has arisen directly because of the consequences of capitalist society, both economically and politically. We've seen the explosion of this horrific virus around the globe, which has had devastating effects on the lives of millions of working people. And yet even the issue of the pandemic has not been anticipated and prepared for by any of the capitalist governments around the world. They have received report after report for years now, warning of a pandemic being imminent, that a pandemic could break out. It was on avian flu. A whole series of warnings have been put forward in relation to other pandemics which didn't break. But nevertheless, the ruling classes and the governments of the world completely failed to act on that advice and those warnings from scientists and medical experts. And now we see the consequences of it. And then it's compounded by what they've done as a ruling class and all of the capitalist governments over the last 20 or 30 years. They've had a policy of austerity, of cutbacks, of destruction of the health services in a whole series of different countries, the running down of the services in the advanced capitalist countries, in Europe in particular. Of course, in the neo-colonial world of Asia, Africa, Latin America, they barely exist. You have a completely privatized system in the United States, which excludes the vast majority of the working class population in the US from having any real meaningful health care. And then you see a complete lack of coordination as far as the capitalist classes are concerned when they've been confronted with this particular crisis. You've seen the layoffs involving millions of working people on every single continent. And it's illustrated very clearly the complete incapacity of capitalism to protect the population on a healthy and genuine basis. And it showed a crisis-ridden system from top to bottom.
And you've touched there on the layoffs, because this isn't just about the health system, is it? This isn't just about public services. This is having a incredibly devastating impact economically, and no part of the world seems to be able to escape that aspect of the crisis either.
That's absolutely true, because what you see now is a collapse taking place of production. It's a major crisis which is gripping the whole of the capitalist world. There's not a single country or continent unaffected by this, and it's been devastated. The falls of production and shrinkage of the GDPs that have taken place in a whole series of countries are worse than what took place in the depression that took place in the 1930s on a global scale. You've had an estimated fall of 15% in the GDP in China they're anticipating. You've had that put forward as a possibility here for Britain as well. And in country after country, you now have the prospect of not only a recession, but the possibility of a depression. Every single capitalist economist is warning that we've now faced the prospect not only of a prolonged recession, but of a depression taking place on a global scale. And of course, that is going to have absolutely devastating consequences in terms of unemployment, in terms of poverty, in terms of the prospect of social conflict and upheaval, of starvation and hunger, as we're already seeing beginning to unfold as a consequence of this crisis. And this crisis directly flows from what they've implemented of neoliberal policies in the past period. The deregulations that have taken place of the food industry, of the markets, is all resulted the way in the unfolding of this particular pandemic.
Absolutely, and you've talked there a bit about the neoliberal policies that have left services, workers' living standards unprepared in any way to deal with this natural phenomenon. But all around the world, we're also seeing governments in response to this crisis, in an attempt to keep, save their system. Basically, capitalist politicians have been chucking those neoliberal policies that have dominated decisions over the last decades. They're just chucking them out the window, aren't they? Privatisation has been replaced with spending, cuts have been replaced with nationalisation, massive spending programmes. What's the CWI's analysis of that programme? Because some people are saying, are we starting to see socialism in action now?
Well, it is quite remarkable what we've seen in terms of the speed with which the capitalist class in country after country has just jettisoned all of their ideology that they've defended for the last 20 or 30 years. Neoliberalism, non-state intervention, small states has all been jettisoned. As we've seen in country after country, that the private sector and the capitalist companies are incapable of dealing with a crisis of this particular magnitude. And what is this crisis meaning? Because I think we should not simply dress it up in terms of figures. You have an absolutely horrific situation unfolding in Europe. It's true in the United States in terms of the pandemic's effect there, but also in the neo-colonial world, the brutality of what has taken place. According to some estimates, 80 million workers in India have already lost their jobs. You see migrant labourers being driven out of the cities with nothing, no food, no income, left to starve, provoking riots. We've seen the intervention in the favelas in Brazil of the drug gangs who have tried to enforce a lockdown for their own particular reasons, of reports of hunger and starvation beginning to set in the south of Italy, in Europe. All of this is going to provoke a massive backlash and food riots and protests in different countries. But they have taken the step of just jettisoning their programme, and it's incredible what they've done. They've abandoned neoliberalism. They've gone back to state intervention. We see the package announced in the US, which I believe is the largest ever bailout package that's ever been put forward, of over $2 trillion US dollars. We see 750 billion euros put into the European economies by the European Central Bank. In country after country, it's been a similar policy has been applied, and all of that's been done, taken up with measures of state intervention, nationalisation. In Spain, we've seen the nationalisation of the private sector of the health sector. In a series of other countries, here in Britain, you've had a de facto renationalisation of the railways has taken place. You've had state intervention in other countries. Even Trump now has been forced to do a somersault and has gone for a policy of a state intervention based on the Wartime Act and directed companies like General Motors and others to go over to producing ventilators. And it's been an incredible position in terms of a complete somersault of everything that we've been told for the last 20 or 30 years by the proponents of the capitalist system and the defenders of neoliberal policies. Now, they have done that in order to step in desperately to try and prop up their system. They're terrified of the consequences of what a lengthy recession or a depression in the economy would mean. And we should emphasise at this point, we have quite a unique situation from the point of view of capitalist history, because we have a multi-factor of crisis taking place at the present time because of the nature of the pandemic. You have a crisis of supply, and you have a crisis of demand because of people losing their jobs, they don't have the income, they're spending less. And of course, production, at least in some spheres, has been either completely paralysed or is increasingly brought to a stop. And they've been compelled to intervene to try and avert a disaster, a catastrophe taking place. Now, that may buy them some time, it is true, in terms of the state interventions that they've been forced to undertake. But it's not going to have the consequences of avoiding their system being plunged into an even deeper crisis, which is going to be aggravated as this pandemic unfolds over the course of the next period of time. Now, it's true, some capitalist commentators, the points have not been lost on them. We've had here in Britain, commentators have correctly pointed out that Johnson, ironically enough, has in effect, in the space of about a week, has implemented most of Jeremy Corbyn's programme, which of course they were ridiculing during the election only a short time ago. We've had other commentators in Germany and elsewhere warning that that the market is being tested to its limits in terms of its practicalities. And in terms of, we've seen others talking about the question that you've seen socialist intervention. Now, what they've done has been reversing back to an extreme form of Keynesianism and state intervention. Is not from the point of view of introducing a democratic socialist plan of production, but nevertheless they've reverted to a policy of state intervention, which capitalism has had before. And by the way, they've used these sort of measures historically. We saw state intervention in the post-war period, but even during the war in the 1930s, you saw capitalist governments also resort to a policy of state intervention. Roosevelt in the United States undertook an incredible program of public works through the New Deal, which resulted in the construction of a whole series of transport systems, of electricity supply was developed. Manufacturing industry was even confiscated in some cases as they turned production over to the armaments that were necessary during the course of the war. So they have done this historically to try and prop up their system. The question is, though, having done this now, what is going to be the political and economic consequences and the conclusions that the majority of workers draw? Because it's very difficult to envisage a situation after this crisis that people are going to accept that the market's all okay, the privatisation of everything is okay, when the privatisation of the health system, of production and of transport has proved to be an unmitigated disaster when confronted with a crisis of this character.
So you've talked there about the incredible, unprecedented measures that are being taken by governments with regards to the state intervention and for the reasons that you've described there, Tony. Thank you for that. But that there's other aspects to the government's action at the moment, isn't there? We're also seeing state repression measures being introduced, aren't we?
We are. I would say there's a general tendency internationally towards a certain militarisation of society, and in some situations that has at this stage won widespread support because it has been fairly seen as necessary to deal with the immediate effects of this particular crisis. But at the same time, we see big dangers posed within within these measures, because we would support, as the CWI, any measures that are necessary to defend the health and well-being of working people. And that, of course, is something which will be paramount as far as our position, our policies and our ideas are concerned, to defend the interests of all working people around the planet. But at the same time, what we are not prepared to support is measures being introduced that are not in any way under the democratic scrutiny and the democratic control of the mass of the population. We've seen measures introduced in a series of countries which are extremely dangerous, Within the European Union, you see in Hungary, for example, Orban has now assumed unlimited powers to be able to rule by decree, which is there. You're seeing the deployment of the army and the police, powers to stop and search, repressive measures being introduced in a whole series of countries, which is extremely dangerous as far as defending the interests of ordinary working people are concerned. So we support all measures necessary to defend the health and well-being of working people, but we believe it is absolutely essential that that is carried through on the basis of democratic check and control by the trade unions and by working people in general. Because we've also seen during this crisis how it's been used. In Sri Lanka, for example, we have a very limited number of people who have been infected by the coronavirus, and yet the Sri Lankan government has used it to impose a de facto a curfew, where I think people are only allowed out of their houses for 6 hours a day, and the military are back on the streets. The military have been redeployed in evening and nighttime curfews in Chile, following the protests that have taken place there. And we're seeing similar measures adopted in other parts of the world as well, which of course we do not trust the ruling class governments to deploy any measures on a democratic basis as a means of defending the rights and interests of the working peoples and the poor of the different countries.
Thanks, Tony. And you talked there about how things that are happening in all different countries around the world, and this is, like you've explained, an international phenomenon at different rates and paces at different parts of the world. But so far we've not seen an international response, and will we see an international response in your view?
Well, I think if you look at what's taken place, what it's revealed is another process of capitalism in the course of the recent period. If you take the crisis following the global financial crisis in 2007 and 8, relatively quickly, the capitalist classes of the different got their act together and coordinated a policy of intervention to prop up the banks. This time, since then, you've seen an intensification of a process of deglobalization of the economy, a reversion to protectionism and nationalism has been the dominant trend in the course of the past period, and that's been reflected in this crisis. As the crisis has deepened, every country has just taken panic measures to try and defend their own interests. There's been virtually no coordinated action at an international level, where they've tried to have summits and meetings to work a policy out. They've either concluded nothing or have really broken down. You had the farce last week in the European Union of a summit of the European Union leaders, which is the Guardian correspondent Larry Elliott commentated yesterday. It was a car crash of a meeting, where a complete rupture and difference of opinion between the countries in the south of Europe, most affected by the crisis, Spain, Italy and France, were at odds with the policies being demanded by the governments of the north of Germany, the Netherlands and other countries. And there's a breakdown of this position taking place. And you've seen the real nature of these capitalist blocs as they've refused to step in and organise any coordinated action. In Europe, the most devastating effects of the crisis have been felt in Italy. Now, we oppose the right-wing Italian populist nationalist government, but they appealed for help from the European Union and they got absolutely zero response from it. And in fact, it was left to the Chinese to step in for their own particular reasons to offer some sort of help to the Italian government, supplying of medical facilities, doctors and others, together with the Cubans. And what you're seeing really is a breakdown of the regional blocs as each capitalist class has taken its measures to defend its own interests, and they're heading for an even greater disaster. They should add they've had this state intervention. After this crisis is over, the capitalist class are going to come back and demand in one form or another that the working people of this planet pay for this crisis. We should also add these measures of state intervention, of piling up of debt, of going back to Keynesian measures, come on the back of the accumulation of global debt, which reached a staggering figure of $250 trillion before the onset of the pandemic position. And the capitalist class are going to come back after this crisis, demanding the working people pay, either directly or indirectly. So we're in for a period of intense upheavals and social conflict.
Thanks, Tony. Now, the CWI obviously follows all the developments in the world, follows like you just discussed, the relations between world powers and so on. But the CWI also generally will comment on the tasks for the workers' movement in a situation like this, and especially in this level of crisis. This is no exception, is it, that we must say what the tasks are for the working class, for our class, and for the struggle?
Absolutely, because if you look at the measures that have been taken, where the governments have acted, often it's been the result, or usually it's been the result, of the mass pressure of working people for a demand for action. And the governments have generally reacted extremely slowly. But nobody is going to defend the health and interests of working people apart from working people themselves. And that's been shown on a whole series of occasions during the course of this particular crisis. We see magnificent demonstrations of solidarity, of support for the frontline workers, particularly those in the health sector, in all countries. Those workers working under intense pressure in transport, in the supermarkets, etc. We've seen marvellous demonstrations of human solidarity between people coming together in local communities to look after the old, the sick, and the most vulnerable people who could be affected by this terrible virus. And it's left to the trade unions on many occasions, on all occasions, to come forward with demands of a minimal character for the necessary equipment to protect people from the virus, from the issue of other safety measures, of social distancing in the workplaces, of how the workplaces are indeed organised. All of that comes down to the need for the trade unions to maintain an independent policy and fight for the health and welfare of their own members and the working class communities of the mass of the population in general, because the governments are not going to do it unless they're forced and compelled to do it. But we have to go a little bit further, I think, than that, because it's a question also then of what happens after this crisis. Because in this crisis, what is being put on the table, what's being put in the dock, is capitalism itself. Of this society, what sort of world has this neoliberal capitalism resulted in? And it's resulted in an utter catastrophe for the vast mass of the population. We see horrific conditions being revealed even before the crisis, but of course increasingly intensified as a consequence of the crisis itself. And capitalism itself is now being put in the dock increasingly. There's an increasing questioning by people as to what sort of society we have, where profit and production for the greed of the shareholders, for the greed of the owners of the companies, all of that is put above the health and welfare of ordinary working people. And you see working people react against it. We had the news of strikes in Spain and Italy. We've had the strikes here in London of cleaners in the hospitals because they weren't being paid. But then in America, we had a marvellous report yesterday of General Electric workers who came together and organised strike action because they were demanding that production in their workplace should be turned over to produce ventilators to help the sick rather than remain idle. There's an element being posed there of workers beginning to take matters into their own hands, and the beginnings of outlines of some elements of workers' control being posed as a result of such actions. And we support all measures by workers like that to take that. But it illustrates once again that it's the labour movement and workers' organisations that must take their own independent initiative and actions. There's a lot of appeals internationally for national unity, for everybody to come together. Well, we understand those sentiments. We stand for the maximum unity of all working people against all races, religions, gender, and all issues that have been used to try and divide working people. We stand for the unity of the peoples within each country and between each country. But one thing we warn against is that we don't stand for the unity with the ruling classes, with those who are responsible in their governments of capitalism, who are responsible for intensifying this crisis, who are responsible for presiding over a system which has really, at the end of the day, has given rise to the crisis itself.
Okay, thanks, Tony. And I think that leads nicely onto my final question for today's interview, which is, where does this all leave the struggle for socialism? Because some people might think that's something to come back to later. We've just got to get through the current situation. But I think everything that you've said today about the rottenness of capitalism, how it's being exposed, will be leading a lot of people to think about what is the socialist alternative? Is that now possible? What would you have to say about that?
I think, as I said before, that the question that the system of capitalism has been placed in the dock as a consequences of this crisis. What has been revealed in this particular crisis more than others is, of course, there's no national solution. An international solution is absolutely necessary. And from this crisis, there will be intensification of struggle as the crisis deepens, as workers are forced to struggle to defend their own basic interests of getting food supplies organised, getting access to food, and of course other vital basic elements of life that are necessary for people to survive. And by putting capitalism in the dock, the issue will then be posed, well, what is the alternative? It's been demonstrated very clearly that we need an international alternative. But what has also been demonstrated, in part by the state interventions that have been made, is that it's necessary to have planning. It's necessary to have public ownership of the big corporations. So you don't have the insane position of a whole series of companies producing for their own interests and profit in competition, but you have a coordinated plan where you bring together the technical and the human resources that are available and plan it on a democratic basis to meet the demands and needs of the mass of the population of each country and indeed of the planet. And that will pose the issue of socialism. It poses the issue of the need to build fighting combative trade unions to defend the interests of working people, but also to build a political voice that will argue for an alternative system of democratic planning and democratic socialism. And there are historical examples from this. New parties and new political forces can emerge that will defend the interests of the working class. We've seen at this stage probably most of the leaders in most countries have increased their support in the opinion polls as people out of fear have rallied behind their government supporting any of the more positive measures that they have taken. That can turn into its opposite very quickly. Trump's up in some of the opinion polls. Johnson here is in Britain. Probably in other countries that will be the case as well. But it can change very rapidly as the incompetence and ineptness of the different governmental leaders becomes increasingly demonstrated. And it will pose the need and demonstrate the urgency for a new political forces to be built that represent the interests of working class and the poor in each country and indeed internationally. Now we have historical examples of previous movements where health crises have been used for this. A number of commentators have pointed out, if you look back historically, the workers' movement in many European countries partly developed, not entirely, but partly developed on the basis of taking up public health issues, sanitation and other questions. We had the tremendous example of what was done for the former mass Trotskyist party of the working class in Sri Lanka, which consolidated and built a mass base through its campaign in the fight against malaria at a certain stage. And that is, of course, the situation is somewhat different today, but nevertheless it illustrates that from these crises and from these problems, new forces can be built and can be emerged that will defend the interests of working people and put a real socialist alternative on the agenda as being the only viable alternative to this new era of crisis. Because what we're entering here is not a short-term crisis, it's going to last a few months. We're going into a whole new era of turmoil and upheaval, of capitalist crisis and capitalist conflict is what is going to be posed. And the need for a fighting socialist alternative as political parties, the forces of the Committee for Workers International and others, is absolutely crucial to put the issue of socialism on the order of the day, because the horrors which are now unfolding clearly illustrate that what we're facing now increasingly in many countries is the alternative between socialism and a collapse into barbarism. India, parts of Brazil, other countries, that issue of the threat of barbarism is clearly posed and evident in how society is developing at this stage. There can be a furious backlash against Bolsonaro in Brazil and against Modi in India. In fact, in some respects, it's already beginning to develop. But the choice now facing humanity is, do we want to move forward to utilise the science, the skill, the techniques which humankind has at its disposal, to harness that to really build a humane society which ends misery, poverty and disease on a permanent basis, or do we want to plunge back into barbarism, increased misery, poverty, conflict and war? And that is increasingly the choice which is being posed before humankind as a consequence of this society. And from that, we hope that the CWI will play its crucial role in fighting for building our forces, fighting for our socialist policies, and would appeal to all those who are looking for an alternative to this system to join us in that struggle for a better, more humane and a socialist world.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that and all your answers today. And I would echo Tony's appeal there for people who've watched this and agree with what Tony's been saying to join the CWI, to help us build it in the countries where we're already building sister parties of the CWI, or to start in new areas of the world. But we want to hear from you as well. I mean, today has been our second attempt to go live on Facebook. Some of you may have watched the previous one, but we're working on the technology to make sure that we can bring socialist ideas for discussion to those on Facebook and for discussion in all the areas. But we want to hear from you. What's happening in your area? Tony has touched on some of the issues that are being reported to us by our members on the ground, of struggle, of the issues being discussed and debated in the workplaces and in the communities, about how working class people are starting to organise themselves in defence of safety and rights in this crisis situation. So please get in touch. Send us questions, comment on the Facebook video, get in touch with socialistworld.net through all the links there. And this will hopefully be the first of many, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much for watching today.